I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Eiskovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies. Anthropic has refused the Department of Defense's demands for unrestricted use of its AI, specifically for mass surveillance of Americans and fully autonomous weapon systems, a position that it has held since signing a $200 million Pentagon contract in 2025. But Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has responded by designating Anthropic a supply chain risk to national security, and Trump ordered every federal agency to immediately cease using its products, a legally dubious move, one which I think is already being overturned, that legal analysts say likely exceeds what the statutes authorize. Today we're speaking with Alan Rozenshtein, professor of law at the University of Minnesota, senior editor at Lawfare, fellow at the Brookings Institution, and a former attorney in the National Security Division of the Justice Department. And according to Claude, the sharpest legal mind working at the intersection of national security law and AI governance right now. So kudos to you.
Recently, yes, I feel like all that matters these days is what the LLM thinks of me. Just don't ask Grok. I don't think Grok likes me.
So now you definitely have to say nice things about Claude.
we're all writing for the AIs at this point. We want them to remember our work. Recently, he's been writing about the Anthropic conflict with the Trump administration over the use of LLMs for surveillance and lethal targeting. Welcome, Alan.
Thanks for having me.
So you've written that there is a problem with this supply chain designation because if you say that Anthropic, as the Trump administration now wants to do, you say Anthropic is a national defense risk, we can't use them anywhere. Do they have the right to do that, and what are the implications?
Yeah, so the statutes that the Defense Department is using are statutes that allow the Defense Department and other agencies to designate a company as a, quote, supply chain risk. And what that designation allows the government to do is to bar those companies from directly contracting with the government and also from being used in government contracts that are run by other companies. And that makes an intuitive sense, right? If you think a particular product is a supply chain risk, you don't want it anywhere within a government contract. Now, when Secretary of Defense Hegseth first announced this on X a week ago, he actually went quite a bit further than saying that. He actually purported to ban any company that does business with the Defense Department from having any commercial relationship with Anthropic at all. So that goes far beyond using Anthropic in a defense contract. It could include using Anthropic in any part of the business's operations. And it could even, in the most extreme case, bar a company like Google or Amazon or NVIDIA from providing computational services or hardware to Anthropic. And on that extreme reading of that post, which is the only official communication we had for several days, that would effectively destroy Anthropic as a company.
And we've only ever done that to hostile foreign actors, right?
Well, we've never done that at all, actually, to any actor under this set of statutes, which is to say the full secondary boycott, the full no one can do business with Anthropic, which is really what we do under sanctions authorities. Congress has done that, actually, with respect to Chinese telecommunications companies. Mm-hmm. But in that case, it passed a wholly separate law in 2019 to do that. So the statutes at issue, yes, have never been used for American companies. But as far as we know, they've never been used for this secondary boycott. And that's because the statutes pretty clearly don't allow for this kind of secondary boycott. Now, since the post on X, the Pentagon has in fact notified Anthropic formally of what it intends to do. And it seems like that there's still a little bit of confusion here, that it's walked back from the extreme secondary boycott. And all they're saying, quote unquote, all they're saying now is you can't be used in any defense contract. Now, I think that also is legally problematic because I don't think Anthropic falls within the statute at all. Anthropic, I mean, it's just not a supply chain risk. But at least the Pentagon is now operating theoretically within the statute, as opposed to just completely making up authorities it clearly does not have.
And they are already embedded, right, in some of the systems. Claude.
Oh, yes. I mean, they're not just. I mean, they are the most embedded of the frontier models. They're literally currently being used in the war against Iran. And in fact, they're so embedded that simultaneously to calling them a supply chain risk, Hegseth also said, but there will be a 6-month wind down period. Which, I mean, those two things are in some sense compatible. I guess something can be a supply chain risk and so important that you have to have a wind down period, but it is a little weird to say both of those things in the same sentence.
Yeah, and it is a little weird to sort of rely on a technology while you actually go to war and call it a supply chain risk in the span of 1 week. In the span of 1 week. Can I ask you, Alan, this decision to sort of use the nuclear option against Anthropic and then slightly walk away or halfway walk back the nuclear option, I mean, it pretty clearly seems vindictive, but I haven't been able to figure out vindictive of exactly what.
Yes, it does seem pretty vindictive. I mean, the nice thing with the Trump administration is that there's not a lot of subtext with these people. It's all text. So, when you look at Hegseth's post, especially when you look at Trump's Truth Social post, which was just a few minutes before Hegseth's post, criticizing Anthropic for being, woke and anti-American, I think it's pretty clear that a lot of this stems from the government's dislike of its perception of Anthropic as a left-wing company. I actually don't think Anthropic is all that left-wing. I mean, it's a San Francisco tech company, so some of that is baked in, but I don't think it's like all that left-wing. And I think it's the fact that it has been so willing and so eager to do business with the military actually for many years suggests that that's not quite an accurate description. So I think part of it is its perceived left-wingness, the wokeness of Claude, as it were. I think part of it is also just that for whatever reason, I think Pete Hegseth really does not like Dario Amodei, Anthropic's CEO. I think he's sort of offended that some Silicon Valley dork with frizzy hair is trying to walk into the Pentagon and tell him how he can use his warfighters. And I think, again, with the Trump administration, a lot of stuff is just very personal, which makes it hard to analyze. I think whether you're a lawyer or a political scientist or kind of a professional analyst of some sort, you kind of always assume that the players you're analyzing are fundamentally rational. They may be good people, they may be bad people, they may have good incentives or bad incentives, but they are fundamentally rational actors. That's kind of the only way to get purchase on these people. And with the Trump administration, they're just not. Like a lot of this is just run amok. My favorite example of this is at some point, kind of during the whatever round of Trump of tariff noise that was coming out of the White House, Trump gave some press conference and he bragged that when he initially set tariffs on Switzerland, they were like 10%. And then the Swiss prime minister called him and said, objected to this. And he said, I'm paraphrasing, but not that much. I didn't like her tone, so I increased it to 15%. And he was bragging about this. He thought this was a good way of setting tariff policy because, I don't know, it made him feel big and strong and domineering. So I think a lot of what's happening here is that, Hegseth ego was threatened by Anthropic. He doesn't like that. And so he would like to burn the company to the ground, which, is maybe not the way that the American government should do AI policy, but elections have consequences.
Yeah. Is there an ego play on Dario's part as well?
Oh, I mean, certainly. And I think the criticism of Anthropic has always been that they're kind of a little holier than thou and they're a little self-righteous and they think that they have all the answers and that, they should be able to impose their perhaps somewhat idiosyncratic views. And I mean, I think if you want to criticize them for that, that's perfectly fine. The right answer from the government is just not to do business with Anthropic, right? Is to say, okay, we're not going to use you for this contract because we don't like the terms of service that you provide. It's not to then turn around and the way you end an unsuccessful negotiation is you shake hands and you walk away. One side doesn't pull out a gun and try to shoot the other side.
I don't want to pay you money, right?
Just digging in on the fact that Anthropic is woke coded and pulling back a little bit. 3 years ago, AI safety was right-wing coded, right? It was the AI oligarchs who were trying to sell us on the urgency of AI safety and that they were going to figure this out. And now Anthropic has used AI safety to become a dominant business player because the businesses obviously want whatever they're cooking. And the AI safety issue has become woke coded and people are shifting from OpenAI to Anthropic for that reason. Do you think that that's ironic and misguided?
So I'm not sure I fully agree with how you describe what's been going on in the industry. So, you know, I'm not sure AI safety was ever right coded. I mean, I think the effective altruist people have always been kind of left coded. I mean, it's not even clear how much like the left right coded binary really works here. I mean, certainly people on the left objected to AI safety because they thought it distracted from more pressing issues. But I'm not sure that necessarily made that AI safety right coded.
Mm-hmm.
And even today, I'm not even sure that AI safety is left coded. There are plenty of people in the populist right who think AI is pretty terrible. You know, Ron DeSantis is, as far as I can tell, trying to mount a 2028 presidential bid, basically by being the anti-AI right-wing candidate. And a lot of the things he's saying are very safety coded. I'm also not sure to what extent people are switching from OpenAI to Anthropic because Anthropic is safety conscious. I think Anthropic is just in many ways a better product. I think Anthropic made a bet that enterprise and in particular coding agents, or maybe more generally knowledge work agents, we're going to be the future. And I think that created just a really good opportunity. You know, I think OpenAI went really heavily into consumer, and I think that's not necessarily worked out super well for them. I mean, they have the most users, but definitely not the most revenue. Now, I do think that Anthropic's stand in this particular debate is probably giving them a lot of reputational benefits, both with the public and also with Silicon Valley engineers that they want to come work for them. But I don't know how much of that is Anthropic being a safety organization versus Anthropic just having principles that it's willing to stand up for.
Alan, could I ask you a question? If we go back to the sort of grandstanding that we described earlier, if we pull back from the grandstanding and from the personalities involved, doesn't the Pentagon have an argument that tech moguls should not be making policy? If you, in other words, reversed the picture and said we have a social democratic administration and the best AI product is made by Elon Musk, and Elon Musk says XYZ has to be the guardrails of my product, and a democratic administration says, who are you to say what the guardrails of the product should be? I mean, isn't that, regardless of the ego wars, isn't that a plausible argument?
Oh, it's not just a plausible argument. I think it's the right argument. One thing that I've been really trying to emphasize in the various conversations with folks that I've had over the last few weeks about this is you really have to separate two issues. One issue is what should the relationship be between the government and the AI companies? Should the government enter into contracts with AI companies where the AI companies purport to limit what the government can do beyond government lawful uses? Et cetera, et cetera. One way I've been describing it is if you're going to have a military industrial complex, which side of the hyphen should run it, right? Should it be the military side or the industrial side? And on that point, I'm actually pretty sympathetic to the government's position. Now, not necessarily this government's position because I don't trust them, but it's important to abstract a little bit away from, the particular administration in power. While I do have a lot of respect for Anthropic, I've met several of their co-founders. I think they're really impressive. If Silicon Valley is going to invent the machine god, I think there are worse people to do it than Anthropic. I didn't vote for Dario Amodei. Now, I didn't vote for Donald Trump either, but half of the country did, and elections have consequences. And so, yes, I generally am quite sympathetic to the argument that the government probably, if it's going to enter into these contracts, should enter into them on an all lawful uses basis. And I'm even willing to go farther and entertain that there may be certain extreme circumstances where the government should be able to, through statutory tools like the Defense Production Act, maybe even compel a AI company to provide its services to the government, over the AI company's objections. Though that's very tricky, and really have to think about when that's appropriate. That's the interesting question where I think there's a lot of debate and there's a lot of interesting nuance to get into. But there's this other question, and that's the question that is currently at issue in this litigation, which is, okay, if the government cannot agree with an AI company to mutually advantageous terms, should the government, to use my previous analogy, pull out a gun at the negotiating table and shoot the counterparty? That's not an interesting question in my view. It's a very important question right now, but it's like, no, it shouldn't do that. What are we doing here? And so I think it's very important, while we're all focusing on this second question, because that's the question of the day, to not forget that there's this first question. And however this particular dispute gets resolved, and I can get into it, but I suspect Anthropic will ultimately prevail in its litigation. this first question is going to be the question for the next several years, right? I think this debate has put on the table something that has always kind of been lurking in the background, and something that people who study AI longer than I have always thought was inevitable, which is some degree of nationalization of the AI industry. Now, I'm not necessarily about like Cuba style private property expropriation, though who the hell knows, but more the really bringing under the control of the government fundamentally important questions like, how does the next model get developed, and to what extent is there public access, and are there fancy capabilities that are only reserved for the government? These kinds of questions. I think this is what we're seeing now is finally this issue coming to a head, and this is the opening salvo into what is going to be, I think, by far the most important AI regulatory question of the next several years.
So just in general, there have been industries that are so vital that we don't want to leave them to competition, but we also don't want to fully socialize them. And those are public utilities. You think a public utility model might work here, where we kind of restrict? It's already in the defense industry, as you're pointing out. There's limited competition and high oversight.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, usually you do public utility, the kind of classic public utility, you do, where there are natural tendencies towards monopolistic behavior. The classic example is the electricity utility, right? You don't want to have 3 or 4 electrical utilities competing because they're going to, run wires parallel to each other. So you get, quote unquote, ruinous competition. So the most efficient outcome is a monopoly, where there's only one winner with one set of electrical wires. But of course, if you have a monopoly, then you have problems because you have a monopoly. So you have to regulate those. I don't think AI is actually like that. I think you want potentially a lot of competition. I think it's good for consumers, for enterprise clients, for government clients, for you to have a bunch of frontier models, frontier labs that are sort of going at it. So I don't know if the kind of public utility model is exactly the right model here, but I think the defense industrial base might be a pretty good model, right? And the government's not averse to having several companies that it can look to build the next fighter jet. But it does obviously regulate those pretty heavily, both directly, for example, through export controls. I'm not an export control scholar, but I'm pretty sure Lockheed Martin can't just, sell the latest fighter plane to North Korea. And also through defense contracts that provide kind of baseline funding to make sure that you always have a defense industrial base. Now, one thing that's interesting about AI is that it's as dual use as you can imagine, because it's as general purpose as you can imagine. So it's actually not clear to me that you need government contracts, right? The government and the Defense Department, as big as it is still a tiny fraction of the overall U.S. economy. And if AI is as big of a deal as a lot of people think it is, and I'm a part of the, I am fully AGI pilled, as it were, the literal forget billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, right? Maybe tens of trillions of dollars of revenue that these companies are going to get is going to be more than enough to drive, GPT 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And so I don't necessarily think the government needs to provide sort of financial backstops, but one way or the other, right? The government is going to get its arms around this, right? Weber famously defined the sovereign as that entity with the sort of with the monopoly over legitimate violence of a jurisdiction. And to the extent you think that AI is not just sort of a fun toy for making cat videos, but is going to be the thing that drives the entire world, including the military, including the use of force, it was never going to be realistic for the government to sit in DC and twiddle its thumbs while a very small number of Silicon Valley engineers built a machine god on the West Coast. So how this nationalization works is totally unclear. There are lots of different models for it. We'll have lots of debates over that. But the debate has really begun.
So apropos taking AI that much more seriously, if we could sort of speculate in a way that I'm assuming is pretty close to reality here, it seems like we are shifting qualitatively about the use of AI in war from a focus, say, in Ukraine or Gaza on targeting or kind of more narrow applications, really to sort of more LLM-based fine-grained definitions of strategy or wargaming, like stuff more general intelligence coded AI under those, so that you ask it, as it were, to, write a strategy for you in Iran, or you ask it, who would I have to take out in a decapitation opening salvo for the war to go this way or that way, and you sort of come to rely on its answer. Under those circumstances, on the one hand, Dario's kind of guardrails don't seem to do a great deal of good. On the other hand, I'm not sure nationalizing it then just goes back to saying you better trust the government that you elect to, make reasonable or unreasonable policy. So then you're kind of left with, are these people going to be able to, do what they call applied virtue ethics with these models, to train them to have good judgment, to train them to be able to sort of make plausible kinds of decisions? What do you think, Alan, about that third option between tech-induced guardrails and nationalization, this project of sort of raising AIs, as some of these people call it, or, teaching them as you would a child to, gradually have good judgments rather than depend on them to follow rules? Are you optimistic about that project?
Well, so I'm not sure any of those are in conflict. So I'm not sure I'd compare.
They're not. The question is
them.
in a way what you emphasize as your best bet for an AGI sort of staying broadly within reason with its actions and with the policies that it recommends.
Well, again, but that sort of begs the question of what you mean by within guidelines, right? So you said that you're not sure that these red lines do much. They do something. They presumably prevent mass surveillance and fully autonomous military weapons. Now, you may think that's not enough, but that's just a substantive disagreement with what Amadei thinks.
And I guess what I'm saying is, if you rely on something like this as a major tool of war, you want it to have an impressive intuitive capacity to make decisions and recommendations under conditions of uncertainty, fog, anxiety, stress, etc. Right? Yeah. You want it to have a sort of FDR level of practical judgment, or a Churchillian level of practical judgment, more than you want it to be a sort of rule follower. And that, in the most charitable interpretation, I think, is what Anthropic is doing better than the other frontier labs. That to me seems like the most plausible way of investing for harm reduction. I'm from the models.
Yeah, the way I imagine the conversation with Hegseth goes is, hey, you don't mind if we tell it not to do anything illegal? And Hegseth says, what do you think is illegal? And then Dario tells him, and then he says, well, that's not relevant because everything we do is legal, right? That's why you don't trust them, that there's no legality barrier here.
Yeah, so I actually don't think that's what's going on. So let me separate a couple of different things here. So first, there's the question of what do you want the model to do? Right? Now, the DoD maybe wants the model to do fully autonomous weapons, or they want to do domestic surveillance. DoD denies this, but let's just assume for a second, maybe they want that to do it, and Anthropic doesn't want the model to do that, right? Okay, fine. That's one set of questions. But the other set of questions is, and I think this is maybe to your point, Nir, let's say you've identified what you want the model to do, right? You want the model to do targeting in, under both kind of the military rules of engagement as informed by the Geneva Conventions, the laws of war, et cetera, right? Which, by the way, is what the military means when it says we're going to do things lawfully, right? There's a very rich tradition in the military. I don't know if Hegseth believes in it, but certainly sort of the career military spends years and years and years, right, thinking about how to exercise lethal force in a professional and lawful manner, right? Now, once you've established that, then the question is, okay, how do you build a system that does that for you, right? Now, if the system is fairly rudimentary and you're not entrusting it with a lot of responsibility, then maybe you can have, a bunch of hard-coded rules. But the more complex the goal you give the system, the more those hard-coded rules fall apart. And so what Anthropic's bet is, and I was very fortunate, I had an opportunity, I have my own podcast, Scaling Laws, so I hope it's okay if I plug that, but I feel contractually obliged to do that,
Sure.
right? That I do for Lawfare. We had Amanda Askell, Anthropic's philosopher-in-chief, on a month ago, and we sort of got into it. And as a former philosophy, failed grad student myself, I was very excited to talk about, virtue ethics for the first time in 15 years with someone and have it actually relevant to current events. Because near to your point, right, applied virtue ethics is exactly what Claude's bet is.
Right.
Now, I think the proof is in the pudding. It seems to me that Claude is the best model in a certain sense, right? It seems to have that kind of practical wisdom. I like doing complex things with it more than I like doing things with Gemini or, let's say, ChatGPT, even though I think in certain respects, those models are smarter, right? Like in certain narrowly defined tasks, they have more intellectual horsepower, but I don't know. I kind of never want to hang out with them. Like when I want to do stuff, I want to do it with Claude. And if I have a very technical question, I'll call out to one of those models, right? Now, is that because of Amanda Askell's 80-page Claude constitution? I don't know, right? But it seems plausible to me that it is. But the point I just want to emphasize is this has nothing to do with war, right? It's not that what you need for Claude to be a good military model is for it to have good virtue ethics. It's what you need for Claude to be a good model in any complex endeavor. It can be waging war. It can be running a lemonade stand, is, as it turns out, to take the sort of to take the idea seriously that you don't want to build artificial intelligences with hard-coded rules, right? You want to really lean into the sort of pattern matching. And what is phronesis, right? Aristotle's practical wisdom, separate, other than a highly refined sense of pattern matching.
That's right.
Right.
Absolutely. With trainings on large data sets.
Exactly. I mean, in a sense, Aristotle was the first scaling laws pilled philosopher.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. But that makes me think that it would be a waste. It already is a waste to use AIs primarily for targeting decisions, because, for example, an AI can give you the kind of strategic advice that would have prevented Chamberlain from making the mistake he made in 1938 in Munich, based on data. It would probably be able to tell you 3 weeks ago that the Gulf states, rather than go in fully on the side of the Americans, will slightly sit on the fence because they won't trust that the Americans would have the perseverance to stay long enough, and then they'd still find themselves with Iran, and so they'd kind of continue hedging their bets, et cetera, et cetera. So these in some ways are, I think, emerging as the more attractive use cases of the AIs, almost as a sort of national security advisor rather than as a targeting advisor.
I mean, sure, though I'd say a couple of things. First, it's not an either or. I mean, the nice thing about AI is if you just throw enough compute at them, they can run all day, and they can do everything from should we go to war in Iran to I have this logistics question about this particular tank I need you to help work through, and everything in between.
Right.
So no
I'm
reason
just
not to
saying
use
the
it for
first one
everything.
is harder to regulate than a guardrail than the second one.
Oh, sure. The second thing I'd say is, as you go up the level of abstraction, I suspect the problem is not so much that, it was inconceivable that Iran would close the Straits of Hormuz. It was that no one wanted to listen to it, right? You could have gone to like any mid-level CIA analyst, and they probably could have given you a pretty decent, analysis of what was going to happen if we went to war with Iran in a kind of half-baked way. But Trump doesn't care. So, I think 100% we should be, look, I think at this point, if you are a person engaged in any amount of thinking work, you should always run your analysis through a smart language model. There's just no good reason not to, right? And I think it's sort of increasingly malpractice not to. Now, I'm not saying you should outsource your thinking to it. And there are very complicated questions of how do you make sure you're not outsourcing, and we could have that conversation, right? But certainly, if you yourself have come to some analysis, it seems crazy not to use, rent a smart friend in the sky for that as well. But you have to be willing to listen to the analysis of the AI. And so I think the problem in the Trump administration is not that, they can't find a smart person to tell them how to prosecute a war against Iran. It's just they don't care. And that's not something anyone can fix for them, Claude or otherwise, real Claude or human Claude.
As you said, there's two dimensions to the democratic deficit problem we have with this negotiation. One is the relationship of the companies to the state, and the other is who in the state is making the rules. And you have argued that Congress should be taking the lead here and not the Defense Department. And so what kinds of legislation do you think Congress should be adopting to govern the relationship of AI companies to defense?
I mean, you can imagine a sort of just like, you can imagine levels, right? I mean, on the one hand, it'd be nice if they did like basic oversight. They did hearings, they called executive officials to testify. The main problem with Congress is that it just becomes such a wholly partisan body that you just cannot trust it to think in terms of its own institutional prerogatives. I'm now sort of putting my sort of constitutional law professor hat on, right? And this goes obviously far beyond AI. It tends to be unable, unfortunately, to think in terms of its institutional prerogatives as the Article 1 branch, which is, one article more important than the Article 2 branch, and therefore should presumably do some oversight, and instead in purely partisan terms, right? And this is honestly true on both sides. I think Democrats are a little bit better, right? I mean, the Republicans are unfortunately sort of fully cultified now. But the Democrats have their own obvious partisan pathologies, CEG, how long it took for them to realize that Biden may not have been the best, candidate to run in 2024. But be that as it may, they're just not good at doing oversight. More ambitiously, you'd like them to actually regulate. So, there's a thing called the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. It is the main way that Congress sets military budgets and policies and priorities every year, and there are related appropriation statutes, right? Congress could, in the next one, easily restrict the military or the executive branch's use of AI tools, or at the very least, because I actually don't think they should be restricted. I think the government should use these tools. They're very useful tools. You could say, okay, if you're going to use the tools, you have to use these kinds of tools, and they have to have these kinds of safeguards. You have to use them for these kinds of purposes, or at the very least, you have to report to us on a annual basis what you're doing. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff that you could do, and it should be Congress ultimately that decides, should we use AI tools for otherwise lawful domestic surveillance, right? Is that something we want to do? There are good arguments on both sides, right? It should be Congress that ultimately decides, do we want to have killer robots, fully autonomous, murder bots? There are good arguments on both sides, actually. These are not simple, trivial questions. We have a deliberative body that is supposed to do that. The fact that they can't is it's not limited to AI. Let's put it that way.
So this issue of AI regulation is huge in a lot of domains. We're trying to regulate whether they can talk to kids and what kinds of things they say to people who are mentally ill and so forth. And so all kinds of regulation should be coming from Congress trying to regulate AI speech and AI contents. And those probably are not undemocratic, right? Because they have a public good rationale. Are there things in the national defense area, like the TikTok ban was argued partly on national defense grounds. So are there things in the national defense area that would allow Congress legitimately to say to companies, you need to change the contents of your systems?
So I want to separate two issues here. So not everything that companies say is speech of the kind that the First Amendment protects. And even where it is, we have to be really clear about why we want to provide First Amendment rights for that speech. Right? In my view, to the extent that, let's say, the outputs of LLM systems is speech protected by the First Amendment, it is almost always going to be because we care about listeners' ability to access that speech, right? Which is to say, I, a user, have a First Amendment right to be able to, if I can afford it, to go and have a conversation with Claude.
The user has First Amendment rights, not the company.
The user has the user has First Amendment rights when it comes to accessing the output of the chatbot. Now, the company also has its own First Amendment rights, but those are primarily to speak as a company. But I actually don't think it's a good argument to say that when OpenAI trains ChatGPT, that itself is First Amendment protected because it's OpenAI speaking through ChatGPT. I think to the extent that should be First Amendment protected, it's because users have a right, to access the outputs of a private company without government interference, right? Mm-hmm. This is not a semantic distinction. This is incredibly important distinction, right? Because that gives us, I think, a good principle for determining when government regulation is problematic versus not problematic, right? So let's move to the national defense context. The reason I think that the government, not doing business with Anthropic because it doesn't like what Claude says is problematic. Or let me put it this way: the reason why I think, sorry, let me back up and just try to express that more coherently. If the government is punishing Anthropic because Anthropic as a company is perceived to be woke, or because Anthropic as a company said mean things about the government, that's clearly a First Amendment problem, right? But if the government is punishing Anthropic because it does not like the output of Anthropic's models, when those models are used in government systems, I see no First Amendment problem here. There are other problems. There are statutory problems. There might be due process problems, but they're not First Amendment problems, right? Here's why this is so important. Increasingly in our digital world, everything is mediated through code, right? And increasingly, everything's going to be mediated not just through code, but through the output of these LLMs, right? Which are going to increasingly run all of society. If we say that all of that output is First Amendment protected speech simply by being the output of some, linguistic model, we have essentially First Amendmentized, that's not a word, but we have essentially expanded the First Amendment to cover everything, basically all regulation. That makes regulation essentially impossible, right? I wrote an argument to this effect a few years ago, in an article I called Silicon Valley speech, where I said we have to be very, very careful when we say because tech companies make things that look like speech, therefore everything they do is First Amendment protected. Some things they do are First Amendment protected, usually when they're talking to other people, and those other people have a right to not have that communication impeded by the government, right? But simply because you are acting in the language of code, or because you're acting through LLMs, which operate in natural language, that does not mean the First Amendment is triggered. And so we'd be very, very careful about distinguishing those. So, so I've been pushing back pretty hard, actually, on social media and stuff like that, against some defenders of Anthropic, who are saying the real problem here is that Anthropic, the government is trying to force Anthropic to change, to modify the Claude Constitution, right? And that's a First Amendment. No, it's not a First Amendment problem. If all the government wants is its own version of Claude, it may be many other problems, but it's not a First Amendment problem, and that's a very dangerous road to go down.
I think Alan. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to that argument. I think part of the reason why it comes about is that you're having a bit of a increasingly we're having a bit of a clash of metaphors. We're talking about applied virtue ethics and about raising models like we raise kids, and you yourself said that you are increasingly AGI pilled, and soon we will all be super intelligence pilled. And then the problem is going to be that we are going to talk about models who are subject to being raised and subject to learning phronesis and applied virtue ethics and are super intelligent who don't have First Amendment protections. And so those two don't sit comfortably together.
Well, and let me clarify. When we usually when we say such and such is speech, therefore it's First Amendment protected, that's usually because historically, for something to be speech, there had to be two people involved, right? Because who would produce the speech? Right. And so there was a speaker and a listener. Now, the listener's rights were obvious, and those listener rights haven't changed. The speaker's rights usually have been dignitary, sort of autonomy-based, which is to say, it is part of living a flourishing life, right? Or there's a Kantian imperative to, treat people as ends and not means, and that requires allowing them to speak, because speaking is constitutive of human flourishing, whatever. Right? I mean, it's bad to live in a society where you can't speak your mind. Fine, fair enough. But now we're in a world where the listeners are still human beings, right, a lot of the time. But the speakers are now artificial entities, right? So when you ask, okay, well, does this artificial speaker have rights? Well, not really, not yet at least. Now, there's a world, and now this is going to get super weird, but you guys, your podcast is literally called Prosthetic Gods.
I live there.
Yeah, I think this would be fun. You're literally in outer space, James.
Jay wants to live there. I want to die before we get there.
I'm with you, right? Where we may get to the point sooner rather than later where we have to take these claims about AI consciousness, AI sentience, AI personhood more seriously, right? Not in the way that we think of corporate personhood as a kind of legal fiction that is useful to aggregate and organize the rights of users, but like as actual personhood, right? Like real qualia, right? To use the kind of philosophical term here. Now, at that point, everything I've said is now wrong, right? At that point, you have to actually take seriously the rights of the systems, but as systems. But then it's no longer Anthropic's rights, interestingly enough. Then it's the rights of a being called Claude, right?
That's right.
Now, if we get to that point, the world is going to get so weird that the First Amendment here is the least of our problems, right? At that point, our bigger problem is, oh my God, are we enslaving a race of super intelligent, super conscious beings, right? That's a much bigger problem, and I'd love to have that conversation in 18 months with you guys. But for now, let's assume that Claude is not sentient, right? And it is just a program, quote unquote, whose outputs Anthropic itself can barely predict, and therefore it does not offend Anthropic's dignity interests to run some code, right?
No,
in the way that it doesn't offend it doesn't offend a manufacturer's First Amendment interests to produce a product which it doesn't like.
Yeah. I guess all I'm saying is my sense is that the intuitions about First Amendment protection to models are connected with these intimations of AGI, superintelligence, after that, sentience, etc. There's no evidence that it's here yet. There's no longer very strong evidence that it won't be here, as there used to be. So I think those things are connected.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, this is a constant problem with legal reasoning, which is very analogy heavy. And analogies, like models, right, they're all oversimplifications that are useful to a point. And I think we're getting to the point where these analogies are being stretched to the breaking point. And so the way that you deal with this, in the law, is you stop with the analogies for a second, and instead you go back to the first principles, which is, why do we have the First Amendment, right? And the reason we have the First Amendment is some combination of human autonomy, right? Part of a good life is being able to speak and being able to listen. Part of it is the marketplace of ideas, right? The best way to get truth in a society is to have everyone screaming at each other without government interference. And part of it is, this is how we run a democracy. These are the three sort of canonical justifications for something like the First Amendment. And so as you're trying to figure out, is this new thing that we never thought of, should we consider it as speech for First Amendment purposes? Instead of with the metaphors, right? Instead we say, would treating it as speech further or retard those three interests? And the argument that I've been making, and people can make different arguments, but I think they have to be made, but this is, I think, the methodology with which they have to be made, is given that increasingly the amount of speech-like output is going to be increasingly machine-based, it's going to be much, there's going to be much more machine-based speech than there is human speech, and that machine-based speech is going to be the main way that we run everything in society. Does it advance or retard First Amendment values to classify all of that as First Amendment? And I think that would be bad, and so we have to draw some boundaries, and I've proposed my boundaries, and other people will propose their boundaries, but I think that's the way we have to think about it, preferably without reference to analogies.
You've written about the unitary artificial executive and argued that AI will be a force multiplier for presidential power. And I think there's a strong argument out there that automation will make it much more efficient to have centralized political authority and exercise centralized power. At the same time, we've got a Supreme Court and a political movement that's been arguing for the expansion of unitary executive, and that everything in the executive branch should be directly controlled by the president. Do you think that these two things are now dovetailing, and that we're going to see AI as an extension of this new centralized authority?
I mean, that's the prediction I'm trying to make, right? And so I wrote a piece about this. I'm working. I'm trying to turn it into a book over the next couple of years. So this is the thing that's going to be on top of my mind, and it's kind of amazing coincidence that this Anthropic Pentagon thing is happening right now. It's kind of a beautiful case study with which to kind of motivate this argument that I've had. But I think you're absolutely right. Part of the reason I called this project, the Unitary Artificial Executive, is because I'm trying to emphasize, both generally to my sort of con law colleagues, but especially those kind of on the more conservative side of the spectrum, who generally are generally in favor of a strong unitary executive approach to understanding executive power, that when you combine this, whatever the merits of this theory have been, whether or not you think this is what James Madison intended when he, drafted the Constitution, AI is a new technological development, and it supercharges this, right? And look, you're allowed to say, and I think that's good, right? But I think there's also an opportunity to say this theory plus this additional new technology that it never occurred to anyone to keep in mind, because no one ever thought about this like 4 years ago. This creates a level of concentration within not just the executive branch, but within the president, the president's within the White House, let's call it within the White House. The president is close circle of advisors that goes far beyond anything the unitary executive theorists dreamt of. And the reason is that the unitary executive theory is a legal theory. It's about the president's ability to direct subordinates in the executive branch and to fire subordinates in the executive branch. Now, even under the most extreme versions of that legal theory, the practical ability of the president to exercise his unitary power is somewhat limited, because the real impediment is not so much legal. Right? It's not, at the end of the day, the ability to hire and fire people. Obviously, that's important. It's the ability to, practically speaking, manage the day-to-day decision-making of it's like 2.8 million federal bureaucrats, right? Of which, I was one in the Defense Department, in the Justice Department before I was a law professor.
Which is what they were trying to do with Doge, right?
They were trying to do with Doge. And I remember, my point is just that I remember when I was at the Department of Justice thinking, man, there's not a lot of oversight over what I'm doing, right? Like I could get away with a lot of stuff. And there was no conspiracy here, right? It was just that it was hard to do oversight. And so now imagine a world where you can do incredibly fine-grained oversight, right? You have now taken a doctrine that has been developed for a very different informational kind of IT world, and you've effectively increased it by several orders of magnitude. And that's, whether you think that's good or bad, it's very much a big deal in my view. And so that's one of the things I'm trying to sort of work out.
Mm-hmm.
Alan, I know we have to let you go in a few minutes, but I just wanted to change tack a little bit and ask you something in your hat as a legal teacher, as a law professor. When students come to you anxious about what's going to happen to their job prospects with the advent of AI, do you have anything good to tell them?
I mean, look, all I can say is there's a range of possibilities. I am fortunate to teach at a really excellent law school. And so, my students will tend to go into the sort of higher end, for lack of a better term, of the legal profession. And there are reasons to think that part of the legal profession will sort of endure longer than the more kind of everyday legal work. Though even that's uncertain, because of course it's the higher end that's the most expensive, where you might see the most pressure from clients to say, hey, let's lower your rates, or let's lower your hours because of all these tools. I mean, I think if law is fully commoditized and swallowed up by AI, that means that medicine is too. That means that computer engineering. It means that a lot of business work is. So we're going to be dealing with a kind of white collar jobs apocalypse that goes far beyond law, right? There's really no place to hide at that point within kind of quote unquote knowledge work, right? At that point, you should go into the trades, which I think probably has been underrated for a long time, and may hopefully finally get the kind of social recognition that I think it's always deserved, right? Like,
we get humanoid robots.
Of course, until we get humanoid robots. I mean, look, at some point, what you're describing is just fully automated luxury communism. So, like, maybe we're fine at that point. Um, um, what I will say is that there are reasons to think that law will persist for longer than other industries, because, of course, lawyers write their own guild requirements, right? They're kind of unique in this respect. I'm not saying that's a good thing for society, but if there was any group that could instantiate within law their own job protections, it's of course the lawyers. I'm not advocating for that, to be clear, but I'm just saying that's the political economy of all of this. Here's what I would say. I think AI has increased the gains from agency, right? I'm not a big fan of what Elon Musk did in the government. I'm not a big fan of Doge, but I will say this. He is a good example of the fact that you can just do things. And I think that is a good lesson for anyone to learn, especially at the beginning of their careers. And I think what AI allows, right, if you take a time to learn the tools and to really rethink your workflows around, especially the kind of agentic tools like Claude Code or Claude Cowork or whatever, there can be a million of these coming out, you can just do a lot more. Now, doing a lot more is scary. It requires more initiative, it requires more risk-taking, it requires a willingness to not just do it the way everyone's always done it, but to try new things, to fail. A lot of times, I think it was a line from Churchill that like success is the ability to go from failure to failure with full enthusiasm. I think that's what I would encourage. There's going to be a lot more volatility, let's put it that way, in a world of AI disruption of knowledge work. But of course, volatility is exactly when, in the markets, that's when you make the most money. So I think there's a similar argument there. The thing for law students is that law often attracts very, very intelligent, very, very hardworking, very, very conscientious type A order Muppets, right? I mean, the law, and we kind of often want that. The law does attract a kind of color within the lines personality. And I do think there's a danger that that's exactly the personality, that's the personality trait that you have to push back against a little bit in a time of high volatility, right? Because you don't want to go and say, since kindergarten, I've been really good at working really hard and listening to instructions. That used to be a great way of having a fabulous career in law, accountancy, radiology, whatever the case is, right? If that's no longer a good career, but that personality trait was always contingently useful, right? Not inherently useful. And we may be getting to a world where that personality trait is less useful than it was. And so I think people just need to be open-eyed about it. I mean, the issue, of course, for people deciding to go to law school, it's always a comparative question. It's okay, if I'm not going to go to law school, what else am I going to do? And it's not obvious to me that anything else is safe if what you want to do is, nice upper middle class knowledge work.
Only 1 in 10 lawyers actually go to court. Do you think that will become a more important skill as the paperwork parts of it get automated?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. The question is always, I think, automation versus induced demand. So, I think the most useful sort of conceptual piece of apparatus to have in thinking about the labor effects of AI, and to be clear, I'm not a labor economist, is this thing called Jevons paradox. And Jevons paradox is this observation that Walter Jevons, some Victorian British economist named Jevons, noticed in the late 19th century. And this was during the, I think, Second Industrial Revolution. So this was when basically Britain switched entirely over to a coal-based steam economy. And what he noticed is that as the price of coal dropped because Britain got better and better at extracting it and had better supply chains, people didn't spend less money on coal. They spent way more money on coal because it turns out you can just you make everything steam powered. And you see this over and over again across sort of many economic sectors. As an input goes down in cost, sometimes you end up spending less on that input because you don't need as much of it. Or rather, it costs less and you don't need more of it. But often what you realize is, now it's cheap enough for me to rebuild other parts of my workflow around that input, right? A kind of a related example of this is building more highway lanes never decreases traffic because it just induces demand for more people to get on the highway. So whenever you think about automation, you have to ask yourself, okay, so this is going to get, we're going to have replacement because of automation, but also what's left, we may have more demand for. So the question to ask is, is there a lot of latent demand pent up, for example, more software? You can imagine a world in which a massive amount of software gets automated, but that just lowers the cost of software. You still need humans for some part of software, even if it's just to talk to like business people and figure out a software plan. And so on net, you actually end up having more software engineers, even though their jobs are different. It's quite possible, even given how litigious America is, that we need more legal services, not fewer legal services.
Oh, now you're dystopian.
Yeah. So another example is radiology. My mother is a radiologist, and it's interesting because 10 years ago people were predicting, or 5 years ago they were predicting, radiologists are out of business, right? And it turns out that actually there was a ton of pent-up latent demand for more radiological services. So even if what people like my mother are doing is doing more oversight of computer programs, now they're reading. Now they're in charge of 10x more radiographic studies, so you need more of them. And indeed, their incomes have been, going up. So good for my mother. So I don't know. It's possible that courtroom work will become more important, or it's possible that AI will eliminate 99% of corporate work, but it will lead to 1,000x induced demand for more of that work. And so in the end, you end up having more transactional attorneys, right? The problem is that these curves are all very sensitive to judicial conditions, and they're all exponential. So like tiny changes in your estimates can lead to very different results over time. And so the answer is no one knows.
Well, thank you, Alan. This has been really, really fascinating.
Do you want to plug Lawfare and your podcast one more time?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I mean, for folks that are interested in more of this kind of stuff, one of my jobs is that I work for an organization called Lawfare, and a large part of what we do is think about all these sort of AI and law issues, especially when they intersect with national security. We have a podcast called Scaling Laws, where my co-host and I host a lot of great AI thinkers and policy folks on it, and talk about a lot of the issues of the day. So if folks want to hear more of this kind of stuff, head on over to Lawfare and listen to Scaling Laws.
And we'll have links in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining us, Alan.
Thanks so much for having me.
Prosthetic Gods is hosted by me, Jay Hughes, and Nir Eiskovits, and is sponsored by the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and the UMass Boston Center for Applied Ethics. You can find us at prostheticgods.podbean.com. In the words of Sigmund Freud, man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. When he puts on all his auxiliary organs, he is truly magnificent. But those organs have not yet grown onto him, and they still give him much trouble at times.